r/NoSleep. Posted by u/rydenanne. My imaginary friend wanted me dead. I was a mama's boy as a child. When my parents tried to send me off to preschool for the first time, boy did I cry. I latched my tiny body as tightly as I could to her, my arms wrapped around her neck to the point of nearly choking her, my tears staining her brand new blouse. It took time for me to get used to the time away from her, but it didn't take me long to make a friend. Delia was a girl a little older than me. Being as young as I was, I never found it strange that a girl of nearly 7 was still in pre-K. None of the other kids seemed to want anything to do with her, though, so the fact that I spoke to her at all made her dark eyes light up bright like the stars. We became fast friends, although the other kids kept their distance from me. I assumed that they just didn't like the fact that I was playing with a weird older girl. And she definitely was weird. She walked really funny, like you'd imagine a Barbie doll would move, elbows and knees never bending. I took immediately to calling her Dolly, which she didn't mind. I didn't find anything odd about our friendship until she followed me home. I never saw her leave the school, but she was in my bedroom by the time that I'd gotten home. She sat at the end of my bed, unspeaking and unmoving. I ran to my mother, who was changing out the laundry. "Hey, Ma. Can Dolly stay?" She asked me who Dolly was, and I wordlessly led her to my bedroom, pulling her by the pant leg. She looked around. "There's no one here, Benjamin." She gave me a look, one of confusion turning into realization. I wouldn't learn until later that she'd realized that Dolly was an imaginary friend. "Oh. Of course, sweetie." She smiled, waved in the complete opposite direction, and left to go back to her laundry. Despite her odd behavior, I was overjoyed. Later on, at dinner, my mother mentioned to my father that I'd made a new friend at school. An invisible friend. He nodded, knowingly. It seemed that I was the only one in the room confused by what my parents had meant. For the first few weeks, things were great with Dolly. We went to school together, we'd play all day and into the evening together, and then she'd crawl under my bed at night and go to sleep. It was great, up until the nightmares happened. I have to apologize, but I don't actually remember these. All I know is what my parents told me. I'd wake up screaming and batting at nothing. There apparently were a few times where I'd landed a hard slap in my mother or father's faces in my fear-fueled frenzy. Then, it got worse. Dolly had never said anything mean before. Not a single thing. Sure, she didn't speak so much for in the first place, but the few things she did say never had even a sour tone to them. We were building a pyramid out of Legos together when she said it. "Your mommy and daddy hate you. They want you to rot under the porch so they never have to see you again." I just stared at her. She never even looked up from her work, cramming rectangle blocks into one another. Despite that fact, though, I could see that she was smiling. "That's not true," I told her. She snickered. "They're gonna watch the skin fall off your face." I ran downstairs to my mother and told her what Dolly had said. She looked confused, and a bit upset, but didn't really say much past "Oh, I'm sure she didn't mean it." Later on, though, she would bring it up to my father as something I heard at school. There were several similar incidents afterwards. Dolly no longer spoke to me like a child would to another child. She spoke down to me. She'd tell me that my mommy wanted to kill herself because of me, that they were going to push me out of the car while it was moving so I could get all broken up by the road. The further time went, the more in detail these descriptions would get. I told my mother time and time again, and while she did get more concerned as the stories got more detailed, she brushed it off. Finally, after the last time, she pulled me out of school. She was convinced that another student was saying these things to me, while all the teachers insisted that none of the other children would come anywhere near me. It didn't get physical until months later. Dolly had halted her torturous insults directly after I was pulled out of school. For a while, she seemed pleased. A part of me had no doubt that removing me from the school was the intention in the first place. Still, after a while, she got bored. I guess she'd burned off all the excitement that her dragging me down had caused. I hadn't even realized what she had done at first. I was sitting at one of those little playschool tables, almost entirely absorbed in Saturday morning cartoons. I had a cookie in one hand, and the other hand was rested on the table. She's sharp pain in that hand came fast and without warning. It broke my gaze from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and I looked over to find that a pair of kitchen scissors had gone clean through my hand. I screamed. Dolly stood at the other side of the room, next to the entry of the hallway, laughing hysterics to the point of tears. My mother ran into the room and nearly fainted at the sight of my impaled hand. She screamed for my father. I tried so hard to explain to them what Dolly had done. It took my mother off guard. She seemed almost angry with me. "Ben, you have to stop this. She isn't real." I looked over, but Dolly wasn't there anymore. My fingers have never functioned properly after that. When I saw Dolly again, it was weeks later. Everyone else was convinced that I had given up the notion that she existed, but I hadn't. I was still terribly afraid of her. Despite the fact that I was barely 5 by this point, I knew well enough that my parents thought something was wrong with me. That I was broken. Still, after those few weeks of silence, they let up the slack. Things went back to normal. That's when she came back, but this time, she was different. Dolly was dressed in the same pink denim overalls as she had always been. Orange hair and 2 French braids, hanging down her back. It's just that she was older now. Much older. Looking back, I would guess maybe 15, but at the time I felt she was a full-grown adult. She still spoke like a child, and laughed like a child. She made me uncomfortable, but still hung around silently as she had always done. I wanted to accept her back, and forgive her, but something was just so different. Something wasn't right. I told her she needed to leave. She laughed that same hysterical laughter from before. "Oh no," she said in a mockingly childish voice. "You'll never get rid of me, you stupid little beetle. I'm gonna make your mommy and daddy hate you. Then I'm gonna watch you die." With that, she let out a wild scream, and disappeared under my bed. I thought to scream for my parents, but at that point, I knew they wouldn't hear anything I had to say. I felt that, to them, I was already broken. I was already wrong. I didn't need to make it any worse. So I took the hit, and then I took more. Over the span of 2 years, I took physical and emotional beatings from Dolly. I know, it sounds really crazy. It still almost feels like it didn't happen, and I don't think I could even allow myself to believe that it's the truth if other people had not witnessed it themselves. But I'll get to that later. Things finally really came to a head during my 7th birthday. We had a small party, mostly because my parents were incredibly worried about how frail my state had gotten. Due to the horrible things Dolly had put me through, I had become a shaken little shell of my former self. I barely spoke, and if I played, I did it in a state of fear, wondering when she was going to come at me next. My parents had no idea. I had not mentioned Dolly to them once. I learned years later, however, that they had a suspicion that the incident with Dolly hadn't been something I'd gotten over, because I'd scream out during my night terrors. Scream Dolly's name. Tell her to stop hurting me, and to leave my parents alone. They worried for me, but at the time, they weren't sure what to do. We had a few of my aunts and uncles over, with their children, and some of the children I had met at school over the years. I was almost having fun. We were having an outdoor swim party in my backyard. It was nothing huge. My parents had bought one of those $40 pools that inflate as you put water in them, but it was enough. I'd really started feeling okay when I had to run inside and go pee. I had only barely gotten into the door when I heard the laughing coming from the kitchen. I went to investigate, and saw Dolly standing by the open basement door. She was different then, too. She was paler. Her hair had lost its shine, and her braids had become loose and messy. Her overalls, dirty. Still, she had that same awful laughter coming from her pale lips. "I got you a present, little Benny. Go in the basement and check it out." I hesitated, but knew it was no use defying her. She would just make my day worse if I didn't listen. I stood at the open mouth of darkness. Only 1 or 2 steps were visible in the natural light of the kitchen. The rest was just a black abyss. "Dolly, I don't think this is a go." I wasn't allowed to finish that thought before I felt hands shove into my back. I felt myself falling, but that's all I remember. I woke up to a hospital room. The walls were blue, with little animals painted all around. My mother sat in a faded green chair across the room, head in her hands. I called out to her, but my voice came barely to a whisper. She looked up, and broke down into tears. The official story was that I'd fallen down the stairs by accident, though that's not what my parents believed, nor did the hospital psychiatrist. They believed that I'd tried to kill myself. Me. A 7-year-old child. There were a lot of things I didn't know at that point. I didn't know where babies came from, nor how planes worked, or that the Ninja Turtles were just men in costumes, but I knew what it meant to kill yourself. I had to talk to the psychiatrist several times while in the hospital. I told her everything, only because I knew she wouldn't buy it if I clammed up. I thought maybe, for a while, she believed me. She was an old woman, getting close to her 70s at that point, but she had a kindness in her eyes that I hadn't even seen in my parents' eyes in a long time. However, I was taken back when I heard her from the next room, suggesting that I be committed to a children's psychiatric facility for a short time. It was the day that my parents were taking me home. They didn't say no. They didn't say yes, either. They said they'd need a few days back home to think on it. The old woman made a sound, indicating that she understood. If he doesn't seem any better within a week, we'll bring him. I tried my best to behave after we got home. My neck was still sore, so I spent most of my day in bed, watching cartoons. Still, Dolly was there. Her appearance had gotten worse. One of her braids had fallen out, the hair now limp and shedding. Her mouth was full of tiny, sharp teeth. She was grinning all the time. She didn't immediately leap back into her antics, she didn't need to. Her appearance alone, at that point, was enough. Some days later, though, she leapt at the first chance she had gotten. My mother had left me alone in the bath for the first time since I'd gotten home from the hospital. I was sitting in the warm water, enjoying the quiet while my mother had gone off to grab a towel from the dryer. Then, Dolly was standing above me. She hadn't walked over, she had just appeared out of nowhere. Her thin, bony hand was on my forehead and with great force, she pushed me underwater in one awkward, doll-like movement. I struggled, and heard the bathroom door slam hard outside of the tub. I could also hear Dolly laughing, but there was something different in her laugh this time. It didn't just sound like one voice, but three all laughing at once. I don't know when I gave up fighting, but I stopped moving suddenly and I realized that I wasn't going to be able to escape this. It was over. She'd won. My parents would soon be free of me, and I guess at that point of hopelessness, I took solace in that fact. The door swung open and I heard my mother say, "Oh my God. Oh my fucking Christ." I knew it right away. Dolly had finally been seen. She'd let her guard down, and made the ultimate mistake. Then, she disappeared. It took a little while afterwards for my mother to come to grips with what she had seen, and even longer to accept the fact that the person she'd seen had been real. Had been torturing her own son for years. I wasn't crazy. She and my father were not bad parents. Dolly was real. Dolly wasn't human. It took her a much longer amount of time to convince my father of the same. Part of him believed that my mother had gone off the deep end herself. While he began to go along with it out of sheer faith in the two people he loved most in the world, he wouldn't believe it until a few months later, when he saw her reflection in the bathroom mirror after a shower. She stood behind him, laughing. He wouldn't tell me until I was much older and the subject had come up, but she no longer held the appearance she once had. Her skin was so pale that it was almost blue, hair faded and gray, and her eyes were no longer there, leaving empty sockets. We really didn't know how to deal with it. By the time that all three of us were officially on the same page, it was a year after the drowning incident. We were all sleeping in the same bed and I was never left alone for anything. She never tried to directly physically harm my parents, but they'd catch glimpses of Dolly out of the corner of their eye, or as a passing shadow down the dark hallway. Still, she really only showed herself a few times once they knew. She did, however, constantly cause damage around the house. She'd break picture frames or plates and bowls. She even set several fires in the house. It seemed almost like she'd lost a great amount of the power she had over us when my parents had seen her. It was about 2 months after my 8th birthday when I noticed that she was fading. We'd begun ignoring her entirely a while before with the idea that, if none of us gave her attention, she'd have nothing to draw energy from. She stopped breaking things. Then, we weren't seeing her. Not directly. Not in passing. Soon, we couldn't feel her presence anymore and the nightmares stopped. Dolly was gone. It took a long time, but our lives returned to normal. We pretended that Dolly never existed until we were sure she would never come back. Finally bringing it up sparked nothing. I've never seen her since. I've thought about looking further into it. Maybe Dolly was a spirit, or a demon, or something else entirely. I don't know. I think it's probably better that I don't. Digging at an old wound can cause infections. I don't want that. My advice to any parents out there reading this: you never know what'll follow your children home when you send them out into the world. Listen to your kids' wild stories, even if it's something so outrageously unbelievable. Entertaining their stories won't hurt anyone. Hell, if by some wild chance that your child is telling the truth, knowing alone might just save their lives.